The story began like many tales of homeowners clashing with their neighborhood association. A seemingly peaceful community, with well-manicured lawns and a picturesque entrance, had its order carefully maintained by the homeowners association. At least that was the idea. For families who simply wanted to enjoy their homes without unnecessary interference, the HOA was less of a protective body and more of a controlling presence. And in the middle of this balance stood one woman, infamous in the neighborhood, who had taken it upon herself to be the enforcer of rules, the self-proclaimed guardian of the subdivision, better known as Karen. Karen was not on the HOA board officially, but she was its loudest voice, always patrolling the streets, peering over hedges, and documenting every minor infraction. Trash bins left out for an extra hour, grass growing an inch too tall, or a child's bicycle parked on a driveway were enough for her to sound alarms and summon fines. Most neighbors had learned to appease her demands, fearful of the endless complaints she could generate. But one family was not so easily intimidated. The family had recently moved into the neighborhood seeking peace. They maintained their property, cared for their garden, and bothered no one. Still, Karen found reasons to nitpick. The spark came one sunny afternoon when the family placed a patriotic flag on their front porch. It was neat, respectful, and displayed with pride. Yet within days, a letter appeared in their mailbox, a fine from the HOA citing unapproved decoration. For most people, such a letter was aggravating but tolerable. For this family, it was a matter of principle. The flag represented more than decoration. It was a symbol of values, sacrifice, and pride. They refused to take it down, and more importantly, they refused to pay a fine for something so harmless. They sent back a clear response. They would not be bullied into submission by arbitrary rules. Karen was outraged. She stormed to the HOA office, demanding escalations. When the fine was unpaid, she claimed the family was defiant and undermining the integrity of the community. She began her personal campaign against them, making their house the target of scrutiny. A trash bag left outside for collection became evidence of non-compliance. A garden hose stretched across the lawn became clutter. Every ordinary act was transformed into an offense, documented and reported. But no matter how many letters arrived, the family remained firm. They paid attention to their property, and they followed the actual written rules, but they refused to surrender to harassment. For Karen, this was unbearable. In her mind, if one family resisted, others would follow. She believed she had to make an example out of them. So she escalated. The next letter arrived not from the HOA, but from a law office, a threat of legal action if the fines were not paid. The family reviewed the letter carefully and realized it was nothing more than intimidation. HOA boards often relied on such tactics, sending form letters to scare residents into compliance. They filed the letter away and continued their lives. This was when Karen decided to take her war to another level. One evening, after spotting the family relaxing in their yard, she called the police. Her report was dramatic. She claimed the homeowners were hostile, violating community laws and creating a disturbance. She wanted the situation to become official, hoping that law enforcement pressure would succeed where letters and fines had failed. The family was inside their home when they heard the knock at the door. They expected another neighbor or perhaps a delivery, but instead found two officers standing on their porch. Calm but serious, the officers explained that a complaint had been made. They were required to check on the situation. Karen stood across the street, arms folded, a smug smile on her face, convinced that her plan had worked. But the officers didn't find hostility. They found a family sitting peacefully, children playing inside, and a flag waving gently on the porch. They inspected the supposed violations, only to realize there were none. Everything was in order. The home was well kept, the yard was clean, and no noise or disturbance existed. Then something unexpected happened. One of the officers looked at the flag on the porch and paused. He turned to the wife of the household, nodded respectfully, and offered a sharp salute. Karen's smile faltered as she realized what was happening. The officer wasn't siding with her narrative. He was honoring the very symbol she had tried to erase from the community. For the family, the moment was powerful. It wasn't just about the flag. It was about standing firm in the face of unjust pressure and finding validation in the most unexpected way. For Karen, however, it was humiliation. She had involved the police, expecting reinforcement of her authority, only to be undermined publicly. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment as neighbors peeked out from their windows to see the spectacle. The officers departed without issuing warnings, citations, or demands. They left with a simple message. The family had done nothing wrong. Karen, however, was not finished. To her, this was now personal. Her authority had been challenged, and her attempt at control had backfired. As the family returned to their evening, unaware of the storm brewing, Karen began plotting her next move. The HOA drama was far from over. The saluting officer may have given the family confidence, but Karen was determined to escalate the fight in ways no one expected. And soon, the entire neighborhood would be drawn into the conflict. The battle lines had been drawn. The night after the police visit, the neighborhood seemed calm. The family enjoyed a sense of quiet relief, believing that the worst of the drama had passed. They had stood their ground, endured the pressure, and even witnessed the police officers dismiss Karen's exaggerated claims. To them, it felt like a turning point. But to Karen, it was a declaration of war. The humiliation of that moment burned in her memory. She had watched an officer salute the very symbol she had tried to strip away, and she knew others in the neighborhood had seen it too. For someone who thrived on control, that public embarrassment was intolerable. She convinced herself that if she did not reassert dominance, her influence in the HOA would crumble. Her solution was simple in her mind: escalate until they broke. The next week, the HOA mailbox began to churn out new letters at an alarming rate. Every minor detail became a violation. The grass, though neatly trimmed, was described as uneven. A flower bed was accused of encroaching on public view. Even seasonal decorations placed near the front steps were labeled unapproved displays. Each letter carried another fine, stacking on top of the unpaid flag citation. The family collected them like unwanted junk mail, each more absurd than the last. They read them carefully, ensuring that none contained any legal grounding, and set them aside. They weren't careless. They simply refused to let harassment dictate their lives. But the sheer volume of notices made it clear Karen had rallied the HOA board behind her vendetta. Behind closed doors, the HOA meetings became Karen's stage. She painted the family as rebels, claiming their refusal to pay set a dangerous precedent. She warned that the neighborhood's standards were under attack, and if action wasn't taken, chaos would follow. Her words stirred fear among the more passive members of the board, who nodded along, uneasy about confrontation but unwilling to challenge her energy. Soon, the HOA voted to escalate the matter formally, authorizing further legal threats and potential liens against the property. The family, however, was not intimidated. They began documenting everything. Every letter was filed. Every photograph Karen took of their property was countered with their own evidence of compliance. They researched state laws regarding HOAs and discovered that many of the supposed rules Karen cited were unenforceable, or in some cases not written in the official bylaws at all. Her power rested on intimidation, not legality. Word began to spread among other neighbors. Many had their own quiet frustrations with Karen, but had remained silent to avoid being targeted. Now, watching one family resist, they started whispering among themselves. Stories emerged of similar harassment: fines for bird feeders, for chalk drawings on sidewalks, even for children playing basketball in driveways. Slowly, Karen's campaign backfired, drawing attention to the HOA's heavy-handedness rather than isolating the family. Still, Karen pressed forward. One afternoon, she returned with a clipboard in hand, snapping photographs of the family's yard from across the street. Her expression was sharp, fueled by a mix of anger and self-righteousness. She wasn't just documenting infractions. She was building her case for the next level of escalation. That evening, new letters arrived, this time marked with urgent warnings. The family remained calm, though their patience was tested. They knew a storm was building, but they also knew that breaking now would only give Karen exactly what she wanted. Then came the HOA's annual community inspection, a day dreaded by many but elevated by Karen into a spectacle of control. She paraded through the streets, pointing out supposed violations, scribbling notes furiously, and ensuring that every home received some form of critique. Yet it was clear her focus was fixed on one target. By the time she reached the family's house, she treated the inspection less like a routine check and more like a personal crusade. Her report was pages long. She cited cracks in the driveway, though they were minor and common across the neighborhood. She flagged their mailbox as non-standard, even though it had been installed by the builder years before. She listed unauthorized landscaping for a simple row of shrubs. And of course, she reintroduced the original flag issue, demanding once more that it be removed and fined heavily. When the board met to review the inspection reports, Karen pushed aggressively for punitive action. She demanded escalating fines, threats of liens, and even hinted at potential foreclosure proceedings if compliance was not achieved. While some board members hesitated, her relentless energy drove the meeting toward her desired outcome. By the time notices reached the family, the message was clear. The HOA was no longer bluffing. They were prepared to pursue collection aggressively. Yet the family did not falter. They sought legal advice, gathering documentation that revealed the HOA had overstepped its authority. Many of the cited rules were either fabricated or inconsistently enforced. The board, in its eagerness to appease Karen, had exposed itself to serious liability. But Karen didn't see the cracks forming beneath her campaign. She only saw victory approaching, convinced the family would finally buckle under the pressure. She strutted through the neighborhood, boasting to sympathetic ears that justice would soon be served. Then, something unexpected began happening. Neighbors who had remained quiet started voicing support for the family. Some left kind notes in their mailbox. Others shared their own stories of being bullied by Karen's constant policing. And quietly, several began attending HOA meetings to observe firsthand how decisions were being made. What had once been Karen's domain of unchecked influence was beginning to shift. The tension reached a breaking point when the family received an official letter threatening to place a lien on their home. It was the HOA's boldest move yet, one that carried legal and financial implications far beyond nuisance fines. For most families, this would have been the end, the moment to surrender. But this family was ready. They weren't just defending themselves anymore. They were preparing to turn the tables. The lien threat marked the moment everything shifted. Until then, the harassment had been a frustrating but manageable storm of letters, warnings, and fines. But a lien was different. It was a direct attack on the security of the family's home, their sanctuary, and their future. For Karen and her allies, it was meant to be the decisive blow. For the family, it was the spark that ignited their counterattack. They had spent weeks preparing. Every notice, every photograph, every false claim had been carefully documented and organized into a binder thicker than a novel. Their research into state HOA laws had armed them with knowledge of exactly where the board had overstepped. And now, with legal counsel advising them, they were ready to push back. The first step was a formal response, delivered not with emotion, but with precision. In it, the family outlined every violation of procedure the HOA had committed. They cited statutes, quoted bylaws, and referenced legal precedents that made clear the board's actions were unenforceable. The tone was firm but professional, a stark contrast to the frantic, accusatory letters that had flooded their mailbox for weeks. Copies of the response were distributed not only to the board, but also to every resident in the neighborhood, ensuring transparency. That letter sent shockwaves. For the first time, neighbors saw the conflict laid bare, not through rumors or Karen's exaggerated tales, but in documented facts. The HOA's supposed authority, which many had quietly feared, was revealed to be shakier than anyone imagined. And at the center of it all was Karen, the self-appointed enforcer who had pushed the board into reckless overreach. The response did more than stall the lien. It emboldened others. Neighbors began comparing their own experiences, realizing they too had been fined for rules that either didn't exist or were selectively enforced. A small but growing group started meeting informally, discussing the possibility of challenging the HOA's leadership altogether. Karen, however, was undeterred. She doubled down, insisting the family's letter was nothing but bluster. At the next board meeting, she tried to rally support by painting the family as manipulative troublemakers, accusing them of exploiting technicalities to escape accountability. But the mood of the room was different now. Residents who had once remained silent began asking questions. Why were fines being issued for rules that weren't in the bylaws? Why was one family being targeted so aggressively? And most importantly, why was Karen allowed to dictate so much of the board's energy? For the first time, Karen's voice wasn't the loudest in the room. The family, meanwhile, took another step. They reached out to local media, sharing their story of being harassed over a flag and threatened with losing their home. The story struck a chord. Reporters, always eager for tales of overreaching HOAs, ran features that painted a clear picture. A family standing up for their rights against an unreasonable association and its self-appointed enforcer. Public sentiment was overwhelmingly on the family's side. When the article circulated, the neighborhood buzzed. Some were embarrassed to see their community portrayed as oppressive and petty. Others felt vindicated, glad the behavior they had endured quietly was finally being exposed. Karen, however, was furious. She stormed through the streets with her clipboard tucked under her arm, muttering about media bias and outsiders not understanding standards. But behind her bluster, the cracks were obvious. The tide was turning against her. The pressure mounted further when the family's attorney formally warned the HOA of potential legal action. The threat wasn't vague. It was backed by evidence of harassment, defamation, and illegal fines. If the board pursued the lien or continued the campaign, they would face not only legal defeat, but significant financial liability. The HOA's insurance could be jeopardized, and board members themselves might be held personally accountable. Suddenly, the board's confidence wavered. Members who had once nodded along with Karen's fiery speeches began quietly distancing themselves. Some skipped meetings. Others voted more cautiously. The once united front fractured under the weight of potential consequences. Meanwhile, the family maintained their composure. They kept their home immaculate, not giving Karen a single excuse to fuel her campaign. Their flag still waved proudly on the porch, a quiet reminder of what had started the entire ordeal. And as neighbors walked past, many offered nods of encouragement, subtle gestures of solidarity that didn't go unnoticed. Karen sensed the shift and grew increasingly desperate. She patrolled more aggressively, snapping photos of empty driveways, trash cans, and garden hoses, as if sheer volume of accusations could drown out her dwindling influence. But the more she pressed, the more obvious her obsession became. What once looked like dedication now appeared unhinged. The breaking point came during a particularly tense board meeting. Dozens of residents showed up, more than the HOA had seen in years. The family's attorney attended as well, sitting calmly at the back of the room with a thick stack of documents. Karen arrived early, armed with a binder of her own, ready to make her case that the family was a threat to the standards and reputation of the community. But when she stood to speak, the room was cold. Residents interrupted with questions, challenging her claims. Board members hesitated, no longer willing to rubber stamp her demands. And when the family's attorney rose to present evidence of fabricated violations, Karen's credibility crumbled. Photographs she had submitted were shown to be misleading. Rules she cited were proven non-existent. Her authority, once feared, was stripped bare in front of the very people she had sought to control. For the first time, Karen was on the defensive. The meeting ended not with another round of fines, but with calls for reform. Residents demanded an audit of the HOA's practices, a review of its bylaws, and even the possibility of removing certain board members. Karen stormed out before the discussion ended, her face red with anger, muttering that the neighborhood was losing discipline. But the truth was undeniable. The family had not only survived the onslaught, they had turned the tide. The HOA was retreating, the neighborhood was rallying, and Karen's grip was slipping. Yet even in defeat, Karen wasn't finished. She had one final card to play, a desperate act to reclaim her authority. The fallout from the board meeting spread quickly through the neighborhood. What had once been whispered frustrations had grown into open conversations on sidewalks, at mailboxes, and across backyard fences. For years, Karen had wielded her clipboard like a weapon, but now her power was slipping away. Neighbors no longer avoided eye contact when she passed by. Some ignored her outright. Others, emboldened by the family's resistance, stood taller, realizing that Karen's reign of intimidation had been built on little more than bluster. But Karen was not the type to fade quietly. To her, this was not just about rules or appearances, it was about control. Losing meant humiliation, and humiliation was something she could not accept. She convinced herself that if she could stage one last decisive move, she could restore her image and reassert her dominance. Her plan was bold and reckless. If the HOA board would no longer act as her weapon, she would take matters into her own hands. She began sending out flyers, slipped into mailboxes without approval, denouncing the family and warning that their defiance would lead to the collapse of community standards. She knocked on doors, urging neighbors to stand firm against what she painted as rebellion. But instead of finding support, she found closed doors, polite refusals, and even the occasional firm reminder that trespassing on private property was not welcome. The more she pushed, the more isolated she became. The family, meanwhile, continued to live their lives with quiet resilience. They hosted barbecues, invited neighbors over, and maintained their home with care. Their flag still waved proudly, untouched and untarnished, a symbol of the storm they had weathered. What began as one family's battle had evolved into something larger, a neighborhood waking up to the realization that they did not need to live under the shadow of constant surveillance and nitpicking. Karen's desperation grew. Her final gambit came one afternoon when she once again called the police. This time, she claimed the family was operating an unlicensed business from their home, citing the sight of several cars parked along the street during a gathering. Her hope was that law enforcement would arrive, issue citations, and validate her crusade. The officers arrived, but what they found was not a business. It was a neighborhood cookout, laughter filling the air, children running through sprinklers, and families sharing food. The family hosting it was the very one Karen had targeted, but instead of creating chaos, they had fostered unity. Many neighbors had come to show support, a quiet but undeniable statement of solidarity. When the officers approached, the family greeted them warmly, offering food and explaining the gathering. The officers saw no violations, no disturbances, and no reason to intervene. Karen stood on the sidewalk again, fuming, waiting for vindication that never came. Instead, one of the officers, recognizing the family from the earlier incident, offered another respectful salute before leaving. This time, the gesture was not private. It was witnessed by dozens of neighbors who broke into quiet applause. Karen's face drained of color as the realization set in. Her authority was gone, stripped publicly in the most undeniable way. From that day forward, Karen's presence in the neighborhood diminished. She still patrolled occasionally, muttering about standards, but her words carried no weight. The HOA board, pressured by residents and wary of legal repercussions, began a process of reform. Rules were clarified, fines were reviewed, and harassment was curtailed. The neighborhood, once tense under Karen's watch, grew lighter, freer, and more welcoming. For the family, the victory was not about winning against Karen personally. It was about proving that ordinary people did not have to surrender to intimidation. They had stood firm not only for themselves, but for everyone who called the neighborhood home. And in the end, they had changed the community for the better. Karen, unwilling to accept her defeat, retreated into the background. Some said she began focusing her energy on trivial complaints about city ordinances, writing letters no one read. Others claimed she had been quietly removed from the HOA's influence entirely. Whatever the truth, her grip on the neighborhood was broken. The family, meanwhile, carried on with life. Their home became a place of warmth, gatherings, and community. The flag continued to wave from the porch, a quiet reminder of the struggle that had brought them together and the resilience that had carried them through. In the end, the lesson was clear. Power built on fear will always crumble when confronted with unity, truth, and the courage to stand firm. And so, the story of one family's defiance against an overreaching HOA became something larger, a story that spread beyond their neighborhood, inspiring others facing similar battles to believe that sometimes the right stand can turn the tide. The officer's salute had once been a simple gesture. Now it had become the lasting symbol of their victory. And that's how one family stood their ground against an out-of-control HOA Karen. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel for more HOA drama stories, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear if something like this ever happened in your neighborhood.